Huh? Look who finally showed up. The one they can't stop talking about when you're not in the room. Yeah, you. The name that lowers voices. The presence that shifts posture. The one that turns casual conversations into careful ones. You didn't announce yourself. You didn't demand attention. And yet, somehow you became the reference point. The quiet variable nobody can ignore anymore. They talk about you when they think you're out of reach in hallways, in side messages, in pauses that last just a little too long. Not with hatred, not even with admiration, with something far more telling, unease. Curiosity mixed with caution. The kind of tone people use when they realize they misjudge someone and don't know how to correct it without exposing themselves. They can't quite decide what you are, and that's what bothers them because they're used to categories. They're comfortable when people fit neatly into roles they understand. Loud ones, ambitious ones, followers, performers, threats that announce themselves early and burn out fast. But you never fit. You slipped through every assumption without resistance. You listened more than you spoke. You watched without staring. You moved without explaining. And at some point recently, quietly, undeniably, you crossed an invisible threshold. Not in status, not in title, in perception. Something about you started registering differently. Not because you became louder or sharper or more forceful, but because you stopped leaking energy. You stopped reacting on demand. You stopped feeding systems that relied on predictability. And that's when they noticed. See, there's a kind of intelligence they're trained to recognize. The kind with credentials. The kind that speaks in jargon and performs certainty. The kind that wants to be seen as smart. That intelligence is manageable. It competes. It needs validation. It can be challenged, baited, exhausted. And then there's yours. Yours doesn't announce itself. It doesn't rush to correct people. It doesn't argue for dominance. It doesn't need to win the room. It sits back and absorbs. It tracks patterns. It notices inconsistencies. It remembers what others forget they revealed. You see things without trying to see them. That's the part they don't know how to handle. Because when you're around, people feel exposed without knowing why. They feel like they've said too much, even when they've barely spoken. They feel the urge to explain themselves, to justify choices, to fill silences you didn't create. And you're not interrogating them. You're not judging them. You're just present with awareness. You notice how confidence spikes when insecurity is threatened. You notice who performs certainty and who actually has it. You notice who needs hierarchy to feel safe and who collapses when it's questioned. You notice the difference between authority and theater, and you don't comment on it. That restraint is what unsettles them because people who crave control rely on reaction. They rely on predictability. They rely on emotional hooks and social pressure. They rely on others needing approval. But you don't reach for any of that anymore. You don't rush to be understood. You don't over-explain. You don't correct narratives that don't matter. You let silence do the work. And silence, when it's intentional, reads as power. They started calling you dangerous, didn't they? Not to your face. Never directly. It's always coded. Be careful with them. They're intense. They're different. They see too much. As if perception itself were a flaw. What they really mean is you can't be steered. You don't take the bait. You don't play along with unspoken rules that benefit the loudest voice. You don't shrink to make fragile egos comfortable. And you don't expand to intimidate either. You stay centered, grounded, observant. That balance breaks their models because they can't read you the way they read everyone else. They can't tell whether you're agreeing or simply listening. They can't tell whether you're impressed or just polite. They can't tell whether you're disengaged or 5 steps ahead. And the truth is, sometimes you are 5 steps ahead. Sometimes you already see how the conversation ends before it really begins. Sometimes you already know who will overplay their hand, who will contradict themselves, who will reveal more than they intend. You don't stop them. You let people show you who they are. That's not manipulation, that's clarity, and clarity is disruptive in environments built on illusion. They've noticed how you simplify things that others overcomplicate, how you cut through layers without attacking them, how you ask one quiet question that reframes an entire discussion. How you can sit through an hour of noise and then summarize the truth in a sentence so clean it leaves no room to hide. You don't flex intelligence. You apply it. You don't seek recognition. You move with intention. And intention is harder to undermine than ambition. They've tried to place you to figure out where you belong in the hierarchy. They understand. Are you a threat? An asset, a problem, a liability, and the answer keeps changing depending on who's asking. That inconsistency drives them insane because systems don't like variables they can't predict. You don't escalate when challenged. You don't collapse when dismissed. You don't perform when ignored. You simply adjust. You choose where to invest energy and where to withdraw it completely. And that choice, what you engage with and what you leave untouched, has started to matter more than anything you say. They've noticed that when you disengage, conversations lose momentum. When you stop contributing, certain dynamics fall flat. When you leave a space, the energy shifts not dramatically, not immediately, but noticeably, not because you dominated it, because you stabilized it. You were the quiet constant, the one who saw through the noise and didn't amplify it. And once you stopped absorbing chaos, the chaos had nowhere to go. That's when they realized you weren't passive, you were selective. You weren't quiet because you lacked words. You were quiet because you didn't need to waste them. You weren't reserved because you were unsure. You were reserved because you were already certain. And certainty that doesn't need applause makes people uncomfortable, especially those whose confidence depends on external reinforcement. They've tried to test you, subtle digs, slight dismissals, strategic exclusions, little moments designed to provoke insecurity or reaction. And when none of it worked, when you didn't flinch or chase or explain, they had to confront an unsettling possibility. You're not playing the same game. You're not motivated by the same incentives. You're not measuring success the way they do. You don't need the room's approval to trust your own judgment. That independence, real independence, not performative detachment, is rare, and it makes people nervous because someone who doesn't need validation can't be easily controlled. Someone who doesn't need hierarchy can't be easily placed beneath it. Someone who understands systems without worshiping them can move through them without becoming trapped. You don't tear structures down, you simply don't rely on them. You've built something internal, a compass that doesn't swing with opinion, a sense of direction that isn't dependent on permission, a clarity that doesn't require consensus. And that's what they sense now. Not threat, not rebellion, autonomy. They don't know what you're planning, if you're planning anything at all. They don't know where you're headed. They don't know how much you see. And because you don't broadcast it, they're left filling the gaps with their own assumptions. People project their fears onto silence. People reveal themselves when they're unsure how to read you. And you've learned to let that happen. You've learned that you don't need to correct every misunderstanding. You don't need to collapse ambiguity for the sake of comfort. You don't need to clarify yourself to people who benefit from misunderstanding you. You're okay being unreadable because unreadable isn't empty, it's deliberate. And somewhere along the way, without ceremony or announcement, you crossed from being underestimated to being quietly accounted for. From background presence to variable, from overlooked to watched. Not with suspicion, but with calculation. They're paying attention now not because you demanded it, because you earned it by not needing it. And here's the part they still don't understand. You're not interested in dominating the space you walk into. You're interested in alignment. You're not trying to dismantle anyone's position. You're focused on building something that doesn't require theirs. You're moving forward, not upward in the way they define it, but inward and outward at the same time. More selective, more precise, more grounded. And that trajectory doesn't peak quickly. It compounds. They feel that even if they can't articulate it, even if they can't prove it, even if they don't fully trust it yet, something about you signals longevity, depth, a kind of intelligence that doesn't burn out because it isn't fueled by ego, and that's why the conversations haven't stopped. That's why your name keeps resurfacing. That's why silence follows it. Because people can sense when someone has stepped beyond needing permission, and they don't know what that person will choose to do next. Not because you're unpredictable, but because you're no longer externally directed, and that changes everything. But not all at once, not yet. And that's where it gets interesting, because once someone realizes you're no longer externally directed, the entire dynamic shifts quietly, irreversibly. They start watching differently, not with confidence anymore, with caution. Because before they thought influence meant leverage, they thought power meant pressure. They thought intelligence meant speed, volume, visibility, and you dismantled all of that without touching it. You didn't challenge their structure, you stepped outside of it. And when someone steps outside a system without collapsing, the system starts questioning itself. How you don't rush decisions, how you don't explain your absences, how you don't chase momentum just because it's there. You wait, you select, you decline without drama, you accept without over-celebration. That restraint unsettles people who live on impulse and optics. They're used to people revealing themselves quickly, used to seeing tells, used to triggering reactions, used to pulling strings and watching something happen. But with you, there's a delay, a gap, a silence that doesn't feel empty. It feels deliberate. And deliberateness reads as authority. You don't need to dominate a room to shift it. You don't need to correct anyone to change the outcome. Sometimes all you do is listen, and suddenly people start talking differently, more carefully, less performatively, as if some unspoken standard has entered the space. That standard is you being fully present, not impressed, not intimidated, not reactive, present. You see, most environments are built on people half paying attention, half listening, half thinking, half lying, fully aware, fully engaged internally. Even when you're externally quiet, that contrast exposes everything. It exposes who's winging it, who's repeating borrowed ideas, who's hiding behind noise, who's relying on momentum instead of substance. And you don't need to point any of it out. Your presence already did. That's why people feel uneasy after interacting with you. Even when the conversation was pleasant, even when nothing happened, they leave replaying their own words, wondering why they shared that, why they felt the urge to justify, why they suddenly felt transparent. You didn't make them feel small. You made them feel seen. And being seen without control terrifies people who survive on masks. They've noticed something else too. You don't escalate when challenged. You don't disband your intelligence when questioned. You don't react when underestimated. You let people stay wrong until being wrong costs them something. That patience isn't passive, it's strategic alignment with time. You understand something most people don't. Time reveals what force cannot. You don't need to push truth forward. You let it surface naturally because you know false structures collapse under their own weight. You've seen it happen too many times. You've watched louder, faster, more aggressive people burn out. You've watched manipulators overextend. You've watched those who rely on image eventually contradict themselves. And you've learned that the smartest move isn't confrontation, it's consistency. You stay consistent while others fluctuate. You stay grounded while others posture. You stay precise while others rush. And over time, that steadiness becomes impossible to ignore. That's when the tone changes. People start asking your opinion more carefully. They start checking assumptions before speaking around you. They start looping you in earlier, not because you demanded it, but because ignoring you feels risky now. Not risky like danger, risky like missing something important. You've become the quiet checkpoint, the unspoken filter. The one whose absence is felt more than whose presence is announced. And that kind of influence doesn't show up on charts or titles. It shows up in behavior. They've also noticed you don't cling to environments that outgrow you or that you outgrow when something stops aligning. You don't campaign to fix it. You don't dramatize the exit. You simply reduce engagement and redirect energy. And suddenly that space feels smaller without you, not emptier, exposed because you were holding a certain level of integrity in place just by being there. And once you leave, the cracks become visible. People start wondering why things feel less coherent, less grounded, less honest. They don't always connect it to you consciously, but the association forms anyway. That's when your name comes up again. Not as nostalgia, as reference. They say things like, when you were around, this didn't feel so scattered. Or they used to catch things before they became problems, or they saw this coming, and you're not there to confirm or deny any of it. You're already somewhere else, building quietly, learning selectively, choosing deliberately. You've stopped confusing motion with progress. You've stopped mistaking attention for impact. You've stopped measuring yourself against systems that reward noise over clarity. And because of that, your trajectory doesn't spike. It deepens. You're not accelerating toward burnout. You're compounding toward mastery. And that's the part that really unsettles them, because mastery doesn't need witnesses. It doesn't need validation cycles. It doesn't need constant feedback. It operates whether anyone is watching or not. You're no longer optimizing for recognition. You're optimizing for alignment, for sustainability, for coherence between what you see, what you choose, and what you build. That coherence is rare. Most people are fragmented. One version of themselves at work, another in relationships, another online, another and you've started collapsing those versions into one. Not perfectly, but intentionally. You're becoming harder to manipulate because there are fewer gaps to exploit. You don't say one thing and do another. You don't posture one way and move another. Your actions match your internal logic. And when someone like that enters a system built on contradiction, the system reacts, not violently, defensively. They add rules, they shift norms, they subtly discourage the kind of thinking you embody. Not because it's wrong, but because it's uncontrollable. Because it doesn't respond to incentive structures designed for compliance. They frame clarity as too intense, independence as difficult, silence as uncooperative, anything to avoid admitting the truth, which is this: you can't be managed the way others can. You don't need to be micromanaged. You don't need constant feedback. You don't need pressure to perform. You don't need fear to stay engaged. You self-regulate, and self-regulation breaks systems that rely on external control. So they talk, they whisper, they speculate, they warn each other in half. Jokes and coded phrases, they try to predict where you'll go next, what you'll do, how much influence you'll have if left unchecked. And the irony is, you're not trying to influence anyone. You are trying to live correctly for you. You're not interested in overthrowing hierarchies. You're interested in bypassing unnecessary ones. You're not trying to expose illusions. You're just not participating in them. And that quiet refusal has more impact than any rebellion ever could, because rebellion needs an audience. Alignment does not. You've learned when to engage and when to disappear, when to speak and when to let silence do the work, when to invest and when to conserve, when to stay and when to walk away without ceremony. And each of those choices has trained people around you to treat you differently, even if they don't fully understand why. They sense boundaries without seeing walls. They sense standards without hearing demands. They sense depth without hearing demands. They sense depth without being able to measure it. And depth that can't be measured, can't be competed with. That's why they don't challenge you directly. That's why the conversations stay indirect. That's why the respect shows up as caution instead of praise. Because praising you would require understanding you, and understanding you would require confronting themselves. So they keep you at the edge of their awareness, accounted for but not engaged, not ignored but not confronted. And you're fine with that because you're no longer waiting to be placed. You're choosing where you belong. You're no longer asking whether you're allowed. You're deciding whether it's worth your time. You've realized something fundamental. Visibility is optional. Integrity is not. Recognition fades. Alignment compounds, attention fluctuates, direction anchors, and you've chosen direction. That choice is what shifted everything. Not overnight, not dramatically, but permanently. And wherever this path leads next, one thing is already clear. You're not moving toward permission anymore. You're moving toward inevitability, quietly, deliberately, on your own terms. Nord, okay, you gotta do it. Lord again, the Lord, yeah. Lord again,